Welcome back, my family. Before we jump into today's horror stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Your comments and likes really help YouTube push our video and show you even more stories. I'd also love to know, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Drop your answers and suggestions in the comments, and who knows, I might give you a shout out in the next video. Thank you for being here and for all your amazing support. I still remember the first time I saw Amelia. She wasn't the kind of girl who craved attention, but she had a glow about her, like she carried summer inside her no matter what time of year it was. She was only 14, but her laughter had that grown-up kind of confidence, the sort that made people turn their heads. Amelia was one of those kids who seemed untouchable, or at least that's what I thought. Looking back now, I realize how wrong I was. None of us are untouchable. It was July 21st, 2024, when a message started spreading around. Amelia had been invited to a pajama party. It wasn't unusual. Summer in Sweden is long and bright, and teenagers tend to gather wherever they can. But this invitation didn't come from her closest circle of friends. It came from two girls, one 13, the other 15, who Amelia sometimes hung out with, but didn't fully trust. I remember Amelia texting me earlier that day. Not sure about this, but I'll go for a bit. They said it's just fun. I wanted to tell her not to go. Something about it felt strange. These girls had been jealous of Amelia for months. Rumors, whispers about a boy they all liked. They couldn't stand how easily he smiled at her. Amelia brushed it off. She always tried to see the good in people. But I knew the envy brewing behind their grins. That night, Amelia walked out of her house wearing a pink pajamas set, her hair tied back loosely. She promised her parents she'd be home later. She never came back. The place they lured her to wasn't a house, wasn't a living room filled with snacks and pillows like you'd expect at a pajama party. It was an old industrial site on the edge of town. Rusted beams, broken windows, silence heavy in the air. Amelia followed them in, still believing she was headed toward a night of laughter. But it wasn't a party. It was a setup. The girls brought silver tape, knives hidden in their bags, and their phones, ready to record everything. Their plan wasn't a sudden impulse. It was cruelly prepared. I've read the police reports, seen the chat logs that later surfaced. They joked about it beforehand, bragged about what they would do. And when Amelia arrived, when she realized there was no pajama party, it was too late. The first cut was to her neck. She screamed, tried to run, but they pinned her down. They used the tape to restrain her arms, forcing her into the dirt. One of them held the phone steady, recording every second, while the other drove the knife in again and again. It's unbearable to imagine, but they laughed while doing it. They mocked her cries, calling her pathetic. Amelia fought until her strength gave out. And then silence. The two of them stood over her, breathing heavy, blood staining their hands, their pajamas, their shoes. And then, unbelievably, they began bragging. They posted in group chats, sent clips around like some twisted badge of honor. That's how the truth began to unravel. 2 days later, on July 23rd, Amelia's body was found. Someone walking their dog noticed something unusual in the weeds near the industrial site. The police were called, and soon the entire town was frozen in shock. I remember the sound of her mother's wail when the news reached their home. It wasn't just grief, it was a sound that seemed to split the air open, raw and unending. The police didn't take long. They traced the videos, the messages, the digital footprints the killers were too arrogant to hide. The girls were arrested, their faces pale but not remorseful. When investigators pressed them, the story spilled out. Jealousy. A boy. That was it. That was the reason they decided Amelia's life should end. The thought still makes me sick. A 14-year-old girl murdered because two others couldn't handle feeling overshadowed. Their envy turned into rage, and their rage turned into one of the most disturbing crimes Sweden had seen in years. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened. People compared it to the murder of Tristan Bailey in the United States, another young girl stabbed dozens of times by someone she thought was a friend. But knowing it had happened before didn't make it any easier to process. The courtroom was tense. The two killers, one barely a teenager, the other just beginning to look like a young adult, sat there as if they were the victims. Their defense tried to argue immaturity, lack of full brain development. But the recordings told another story. They knew exactly what they were doing. They wanted Amelia gone, and they wanted proof of it. I sat through part of the trial, gripping the bench so hard my nails dug into the wood, listening to the prosecutors describe the wounds, the final minutes of Amelia's life. It was like being cut open myself. Her parents sat a few rows ahead, broken but unflinching. They wanted justice. They wanted the world to know what had been taken from them. When the verdict finally came, the killers were sentenced. But nothing about it felt like victory. Amelia was still gone. Her laughter would never echo through the school halls again. Her pink pajamas would never be worn again. The town mourned in a way I'd never seen before. Candles lined the sidewalks. Her favorite songs were played at vigils. People who barely knew her left notes and flowers, unable to comprehend the cruelty of it all. And the videos, the recordings that spread like poison, were removed, but not before too many eyes had seen them. Some things can't be unseen. Some horrors etch themselves into your mind forever. It's been months now, but I still find myself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying Amelia's last text to me. Not sure about this, but I'll go for a bit. I wonder what would have happened if I'd told her not to go. If I'd beg her to stay home. Would she still be alive? Would her smile still brighten the room? Instead, all that's left is silence. Silence, and the haunting knowledge that sometimes the monsters aren't strangers in the dark. Sometimes they're the people you thought were your friends. A quick announcement here. If you're still here and enjoying these stories but haven't subscribed yet, please take a second to do so. Drop a comment too. It really helps push the video out to more people. Your support means everything, and it truly makes my day. I never imagined that a story like this could play out in real life, but I was close enough to see how money, betrayal, and greed twisted everything into a nightmare. Nashville, with all its music and charm, has always been a city of secrets. And in 2020, one of those secrets turned into a double murder that shocked everyone. Holly Williams was 33 years old, a free spirit with striking blonde hair and an easy smile that could disarm almost anyone. She was working under the name Layla Love, escorting and navigating a life many didn't know about. She wasn't a saint, but she wasn't evil either. She just wanted more, something better, and thought maybe she had found it in Eric Mond, a wealthy Austin millionaire. Holly wasn't alone, though. She had William Lanway in her life, a man who'd had his own troubles but cared for her in his own way. William was 36, tall, rugged, and the kind of man who didn't back down from confrontation. Together, they lived on the edge, and maybe that edge was always going to cut them. The affair between Holly and Eric wasn't supposed to be complicated. Eric had money, power, and a family back in Texas, and Holly became his escape. He showered her with attention, gifts, and promises that never seemed to reach reality. For a while, Holly believed she could balance it all: the secret romance, her life with William, and the image she tried to maintain. But secrets never stay buried. When William found out about the affair, he didn't explode in anger. He thought strategically. He knew what Eric stood to lose if the truth ever came out: his marriage, his reputation, and maybe even his money if his wife decided to leave. William decided to use that. He demanded $25,000 from Eric in exchange for keeping quiet. To William, it wasn't extortion. It was a way to level the scales, to make Eric pay for creeping into his life and stealing the loyalty of the woman he loved. But Eric wasn't the type to hand over cash and walk away. Money can buy more than luxury cars and lakefront mansions. It can buy loyalty, silence, and in this case, blood. Instead of giving William what he wanted, Eric hired men to solve the problem permanently. The men he chose weren't petty criminals or random thugs. They were professionals, former Marines, men trained to follow orders without hesitation. Brian Brockway and Adam Carey were two of them. Strong, disciplined, and dangerous, they didn't need convincing once the money was promised. To them, this wasn't murder, it was just another mission, a job to complete. On March 12th, 2020, William and Holly woke up like it was any other morning. The sky was gray, the air heavy with the kind of stillness that makes you feel like something is about to happen. Neither of them knew they were being hunted. The killers had already made their plans, mapped out every step. They weren't coming for a warning or a scare. They were coming to end lives. That evening, the couple was at home when the break-in happened. Doors splintered, footsteps thundered, and then chaos. William fought back. He always had that fire in him, the refusal to bow to anyone, but he was outmatched. Holly screamed, begged, tried to pull away, but the men were merciless. Guns were raised, shots fired, and in a matter of minutes the house that once held secrets was soaked in silence and death. But it wasn't enough to kill them. The killers needed to erase the trail, make it look like an accident. They put the bodies in a car, staged the scene to mimic a crash, and left them there as if their lives had simply ended on the road. But no cover-up is perfect, and even professionals can't control every detail. When the police arrived, the crash scene didn't add up. The injuries, the evidence, the way the bodies lay, it all pointed to something darker. Soon the threads began to unravel, and the truth spilled out one connection at a time. The investigation moved quickly, pulling up phone records, bank statements, and surveillance footage. Eric Maughan's name surfaced almost immediately, his connections too strong to hide. He wasn't some shadowy stranger. He was directly linked to Holly. And when they dug deeper, they found the money trail. Payments made, communications exchanged, a plan orchestrated with precision but sloppily covered with arrogance. When Eric was questioned, he didn't crumble at once. Men like him rarely do. He tried to play it off, distance himself from the violence. But eventually, greed always leaves fingerprints, and his were all over this case. The former Marines, once so untouchable in their discipline, started to break under pressure too. One confession led to another, and soon the entire plot was exposed. Sitting in the courtroom months later, I watched as the pieces were laid out for the jury. The affair, the blackmail, the decision to kill rather than pay. It all played like a sick movie, except this one didn't fade when the credits rolled. Family sat behind me, eyes red, faces pale, trying to reconcile the loss of William and Holly with the sheer coldness of the people responsible. The prosecutors painted Eric as a man who thought money could erase problems. And in a way, he believed it until the very end. Holly's double life, William's threats, Eric's desperation, it all collided in one brutal act of violence. When the verdict came down, it felt heavy. Eric Maughan and his hired men were all convicted, their arrogance shattered in the face of justice. But what does justice mean when two people are still gone, their lives stolen because one man couldn't stand the thought of losing control? I keep thinking about Holly, about the way she laughed when music played too loud, about the way William stood tall, even when life beat him down. They weren't perfect, but they didn't deserve to die like that. Their last moments weren't accidents on a highway. They were stolen in their own home, stolen by greed and betrayal. And I think about Eric sitting in his cell now, the millionaire stripped of his power. He thought money could buy silence, but all it bought was destruction. The weight of 2 lives rests on him, and no amount of wealth will ever buy that back. Every time I drive past the quiet streets of Nashville at night, I remember that behind those walls, behind those closed doors, people carry secrets that can kill. Holly and William's story isn't just about love or betrayal. It's about how far someone will go when their image and their money are threatened. And in the end, it's a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous people aren't strangers hiding in the shadows. They're the ones with smiles, bank accounts, and polished shoes, hiding the monster that waits just beneath the surface. The story of Polly Klaas is one I can't shake from my mind, no matter how many years pass. I remember the night she disappeared, the fear that crawled into every parent's chest in California, and the heartbreak that followed when hope turned into horror. She was only 12 years old, a child with her entire life ahead of her. In a single night, everything was stolen from her by a man who had no right to walk free. It was October 1st, 1993, in Petaluma, California, when Polly invited 2 of her friends for a sleepover. They were giggling, playing dress-up, and enjoying the innocent rituals of girlhood, never knowing a nightmare was waiting just outside. Her bedroom window was cracked open to let in the cool evening air, and that opening became the door for a predator. Richard Allen Davis was his name, a career criminal who had spent more of his life inside prison walls than outside. He had a long record of violence, assault, and kidnapping, but despite his history, he was still out, walking free and hunting for another victim. That night, he chose Polly. Davis crept into the house through the unlocked window while the girls played in the room. He wasn't masked, wasn't afraid to show his face. He carried with him the kind of evil that doesn't flinch in the presence of innocence. He tied up Polly's 2 friends with strips of cloth, whispering threats that froze them with fear. And then he turned to Polly. Her wide eyes must have begged for mercy, but Davis had none. He forced her to come with him, dragging her into the night while her friends were left behind, bound and helpless. The panic began the moment the girls freed themselves and alerted Polly's mother. The police were called, and soon the entire town was alive with sirens and flashlights, neighbors rushing out into the streets to search. But Davis was already gone, melting into the darkness with Polly in his grip. What haunts me most is how close they came to catching him that very night. Davis, while driving with Polly, lost control of his car and ended up stuck in a ditch. A deputy sheriff came across him, questioned him briefly, but never connected him to the abduction happening just miles away. Miscommunication, failures in coordination, and simple bad timing let Davis slip through the cracks. The deputy let him go, not realizing the girl everyone was frantically searching for was hidden in that car. For weeks, the community searched. Flyers with Polly's face were posted on every pole, every shop window, every school. Her smile stared back from the evening news night after night. Volunteers poured in from all over the state to help. People who had never met her felt like they had to do something, anything to bring her home. Even celebrities joined the call, raising awareness and urging people to keep their eyes open. Hope flickered in every corner, but with every passing day, the fear grew heavier. 2 months later, that fear became reality. On December 3rd, 1993, Polly's body was discovered in a shallow grave near Cloverdale, more than 70 miles from her home. She had been strangled, her life cut short within hours of being taken. The news broke like a storm over Petaluma. Parents clutched their children tighter. Neighbors wept in the streets. The fairy lights that had been hung during the search vigils turned into memorial candles. When Davis was arrested, the details of his past made the loss unbearable. He had been released from prison despite his violent record, despite all the red flags that screamed he was a danger to society. He had slipped through a justice system that seemed more interested in giving him chances than protecting children like Polly. In court, he showed no remorse. He even had the audacity to taunt Polly's family, twisting the knife of grief even deeper. The trial was a long and painful process. Her friends testified about the night she was taken, their voices shaking as they recalled the terror of seeing a stranger step into the room and take their best friend away. The prosecution laid out the horror in detail, from the abduction to the ditch incident, to the moment Davis ended her life. The jury didn't need long to decide. In 1996, Richard Allen Davis was sentenced to death. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he remains on death row. But justice, even when served, never fills the empty chair at the dinner table, never replaces the sound of a child's laughter. Out of this tragedy, laws changed. The murder of Polly Klaas sparked outrage across California and the United States. People demanded stronger measures against repeat offenders. Out of that demand came California's three strikes law, a rule that meant career criminals like Davis could never walk free after a third violent felony. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was something born out of the pain of losing Polly. Her case also led to changes in police communication systems. The missed chance on the night of her abduction, when Davis was questioned but let go, became a lesson written in blood. Agencies realized how dangerous it was not to share information in real time, and improvements were made so that failures like that wouldn't happen again. Even now, when I see Polly's picture, I can't help but imagine what she might have become. She could have grown into a woman with dreams, maybe an artist, maybe a teacher, maybe a mother. She could have laughed at her childhood sleepovers one day, telling her own children how silly she and her friends once were. But instead, her name is remembered in headlines, in laws, and the broken hearts of a family who still grieves. I sometimes think about the two girls who survived that night, the ones who were tied up and left behind. How do you live with that memory? How do you close your eyes without seeing the window open, the man step inside, and your friend being taken forever? Survivors carry their own kind of scars, invisible but permanent. The murder of Polly Klaas was more than just a crime. It was a wound to a community, a reminder that monsters don't always wear masks, and that the world can change in an instant. It made parents lock their windows, hug their children tighter, and fear the night in a way they never had before. And it left us with one haunting truth. A 12-year-old girl, innocent and full of life, had her story cut off not by fate, not by accident, but by the cruelty of a man who should never have been free. Her name will always be remembered, not just as a victim, but as a child who should have had the chance to grow up. Even now, decades later, the story of Polly Klaas echoes like a warning and a prayer. A warning that evil can slip into the quietest of homes, and a prayer that no other child has to suffer what she did. Her story will never fade, because every time her name is spoken, it reminds us of the cost of letting darkness walk free. When I think back on the murder of Randy Stone, it still chills me because it wasn't committed by a stranger lurking in the shadows or some hardened criminal with a long rap sheet. It was carried out by a man who stood in front of a congregation every Sunday, preaching about faith, forgiveness, and love. A pastor, a man people trusted with their marriages, their children, and their souls. That's what makes this story so hard to accept, that the person people thought of as a shepherd was actually a wolf hiding in plain sight. Randy Stone was the kind of man people respected. He worked as a finance minister at the church, carefully managing accounts, paying bills, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. He was practical, grounded, and deeply involved in the life of the church community. But Randy had his suspicions about the man he worked under, Pastor David Love. Over the years, Randy had grown uneasy about some of the numbers in the books, certain expenses that didn't add up, funds that seemed to be going somewhere they shouldn't. He was a quiet man, but he wasn't blind, and he wasn't naive. The truth was darker than he suspected. David Love had been siphoning money from the church, embezzling funds, and using his position of authority to cover his tracks. And it wasn't the only secret he was hiding. For nearly a decade, Love had been having an affair with Randy's wife, Teresa. Behind the sermons, the handshakes, and the carefully polished image, there was betrayal layered over betrayal. Teresa had been drawn into Love's charm years earlier, manipulated by his authority, and what started as whispers of affection had turned into a full-blown relationship. By early 2010, everything was unraveling. Randy had confronted Teresa about the distance between them. He had also confronted Love about the missing funds. He wasn't sure which betrayal cut deeper, the financial theft from the church he cared about, or the personal betrayal within his own marriage. But Randy had reached a breaking point. He threatened to leave the church, to expose the affair, to uncover the money trail. And for David Love, that couldn't be allowed. On March 31st, 2010, the situation came to a violent head. It was a Wednesday, a normal day for most people. Randy arrived at the church office, papers in his hand, still wrestling with what he should do. But David Love had already made his decision. He wasn't going to let Randy walk away alive. Sometime that afternoon, Love entered Randy's office. What happened in those final minutes is pieced together from evidence, confessions, and the chilling realization of how premeditated it all was. Randy owned a gun, one he kept hidden. Teresa had told Love where to find it. Armed with that knowledge, Love retrieved the weapon and brought it into Randy's office. There were words exchanged, Randy accusing, Love perhaps pretending to calm him down. But then the mask came off. Love raised the gun, and with Randy's own weapon, shot him dead in cold blood. The quiet halls of the church became a crime scene. Randy's lifeless body was discovered in his office chair, the gun lying nearby, making it look at first glance like he had taken his own life. That was part of Love's plan, to make it appear like a suicide, a man overcome with personal troubles. But police don't take things at face value, and soon the cracks in the story began to appear. Investigators noticed inconsistencies, things that didn't line up with a suicide. There were no signs that Randy had been in despair, no notes, no messages to his loved ones. The angle of the wound suggested someone else had been involved. And then, the threads began to connect back to Love. It didn't take long for whispers about the affair to surface. People who had long suspected something between Teresa and David now came forward. Phone records showed late-night calls, secret meetings, and a relationship that stretched far beyond what either of them admitted at first. And when police dug deeper, they found that Teresa had given Love the crucial detail he needed: the location of Randy's gun. The affair was bad enough, but the money trail was the final nail. Church funds had been disappearing, and all signs pointed to Love. Randy had known it, had threatened to expose it, and that gave Love the motive police were looking for. Suddenly, what had seemed like an unsolvable tragedy began to take shape as a clear-cut case of murder. When Love was arrested, he tried to play the part of the wrong man, the misunderstood pastor. He stood in front of cameras, denying everything, claiming innocence. But the evidence was overwhelming. In the courtroom, the story unfolded in excruciating detail. The jury heard about the decade-long affair, the manipulation, the embezzlement, and the calculated decision to end Randy's life to keep the secret from spilling into the open. Teresa's role couldn't be ignored either. She wasn't the one who pulled the trigger, but she had been complicit. She had provided the information about the gun, had shared her husband's trust with the man who ultimately murdered him, to the court that made her guilty of conspiracy. The trial was painful for everyone who had known Randy. Church members sat in disbelief, realizing the man they had trusted with their faith had been lying to them for years. Some refused to believe it even as the verdicts came down, clinging to the idea that their pastor couldn't be a killer. But the facts were undeniable. David Love was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He would spend the rest of his days behind bars, stripped of the pulpit and the authority he had once wielded like a weapon. Teresa received 8 years for her role in the conspiracy, her betrayal sealed in legal records as well as broken hearts. I can't imagine the weight Randy's children carried, losing their father to violence and their mother to betrayal in the same moment. They had to live with the knowledge that the person who should have protected them had sided with the man who killed their dad. The scars from something like that don't fade, no matter how much time passes. The story of Randy Stone's murder is more than just another crime. It's a reminder of how power can corrupt even in the places we least expect it. A pastor is supposed to guide people toward light, but David Love used his position to hide his darkness. He stole money from the church, stole affection from a woman who wasn't his, and stole the life of a man who stood in his way. Whenever I think about Randy, I don't picture the crime scene. I picture the way people described him. Steady, kind, a man who believed in doing the right thing even when it was hard. He didn't deserve the betrayal that took him away. He deserved to see the lies exposed, to walk away with his head high, free from the poison that had invaded his home and his church. But instead, his story ended in his own office, at the hands of someone who had preached about love while knowing nothing of it. And that's what makes this story so disturbing. Not just the murder itself, but the mask that hid the murderer. The summer of 2000 in Cornwall, England, carried with it a strange heaviness that no one could quite explain. Some said it was the way the air seemed thicker. Others said it was just the stillness of the countryside. But for those who knew the Ford family, that summer became a time etched in blood and sorrow, when the small community learned that even within the walls of a family home, monsters could grow. Lee Ford didn't stand out much in town. On the surface, he seemed ordinary, a husband, a stepfather, a man who blended into the quiet backdrop of Cornwall life. But behind the closed doors of his house, a storm brewed, one fueled by rage, control, and twisted desires. His wife, Leslie, had endured years of his temper, and her children, Sarah Jane, 17, and Marie, 16, Stephen, 14, and Craig, 13, had borne the weight of his presence in ways no child should. What no one knew then was that Leslie had begun to reach her breaking point, and with her breaking point came Ford's unraveling. Leslie had discovered what Lee was doing to her daughters. He had been abusing them in ways so vile and secretive that it's hard to put into words without feeling sick. For too long, he had controlled the family with fear, convincing the children to stay silent and Leslie to remain trapped. But when Leslie finally decided she couldn't live in that nightmare any longer, when she threatened to leave him and expose everything he had done, Lee Ford made his decision. If she left, if the truth came out, his world would crumble. And instead of facing that truth, he chose to eliminate it. It was August when the murders took place, stretched over 24 hours of calculated violence. Lee began with Leslie, the woman who had once trusted him, who had shared her life with him, became his first victim. He struck her, silenced her, and in that act, he silenced the only person who might have saved the children. But he didn't stop there. His rage had already tipped into something else, something darker, and the children became his next targets. One by one, Sarah Jane and Marie, Stephen, and Craig were murdered. He used a baseball bat, rope, whatever tools were at hand to overpower them. They were just teenagers, children trying to grow into themselves. But in that house, they had no chance against the man who had turned himself into their executioner. Some may have seen it coming in those final moments, the realization flashing across their faces, while others may have only felt confusion. It doesn't matter now, the outcome was the same. For lives, bright and full of promise, extinguished before they ever had the chance to escape him. Lee Ford thought he could bury his sins, quite literally. He hid their bodies in separate locations, trying to scatter the evidence as if spreading it out would make it disappear. He thought the countryside could swallow his crimes, that the earth itself could hide what he had done. But he underestimated how quickly suspicion grows when 5 people vanish. It was Leslie's brother who first raised the alarm. Days passed without hearing from his sister or the children, and the excuses Ford tried to give were weak and unbelievable. People don't just vanish without a trace. Concern grew into panic, and soon the police were involved. The investigation was immediate and thorough. Officers scoured the Ford home, interviewed neighbors, and pieced together the fractured timeline. It wasn't long before inconsistencies in Lee's story started to pile up. He was jumpy, defensive, stumbling over details that didn't make sense. And then the truth began to leak out, not through his words, but through the evidence. The police discovered the bodies, hidden away like discarded belongings. Each discovery ripped another piece of the illusion apart until the picture was horrifyingly clear. When Lee Ford was arrested, there was no grand confession, no sudden flood of remorse. He tried to cling to his lies, to paint himself as misunderstood, but the truth was undeniable. He had murdered his wife and 4 stepchildren, not in a fit of sudden passion, but in a deliberate attempt to keep control, to silence the people who threatened to reveal what he truly was. The trial in 2003 was harrowing. The details of the abuse came to light, the twisted grip he had held over the family, the years of suffering hidden behind the curtains of their home. The courtroom listened in horror as prosecutors laid out the sequence of murders, the brutality of it all, the way he buried them as though they were nothing. The defense tried to argue diminished responsibility, painting Ford as a man under stress, but no amount of legal maneuvering could soften the horror of what he had done. The jury didn't take long. Lee Ford was convicted of 5 counts of murder. The judge sentenced him to 5 life sentences with a minimum of 27 years, though for crimes so horrific, time becomes meaningless. No number of years in prison can measure against the lives he destroyed. What lingered after the trial was not just grief, but anger. Anger at the years of silence, the hidden abuse, the way neighbors and even friends hadn't seen the signs. People replayed memories, wondering if they had missed something, if there had been clues that might have saved Leslie and the children. But hindsight is always sharper, and abusers like Ford are skilled at hiding their darkness behind closed doors. The community held vigils, lit candles, and spoke the names of the victims aloud so they wouldn't be forgotten. Sarah Jane, who loved art and dreamed of traveling, and Marie, who was quiet but strong-willed. Stephen, who was just starting to discover his own independence. Craig, the youngest, still full of childish wonder. And Leslie, who finally found the courage to stand up for her children, only to be cut down before she could protect them. Their memories became symbols of resilience in the face of horror, but also reminders of how fragile life is when trapped in the wrong hands. What makes this story so disturbing isn't just the brutality of the murders. It's the betrayal at its core. A man who was supposed to be a father figure became the family's executioner. The home, which should have been a place of safety, turned into a prison and finally a slaughterhouse. And the very act of trying to escape, of threatening to tell the truth, became the spark that sealed their fate. I think often about what justice means in cases like this. Lee Ford sits behind bars, stripped of freedom, but still breathing. Meanwhile, Leslie and her 4 children lie in graves, their voices silenced forever. Can justice ever truly exist in such a contrast? Perhaps the only justice is in remembering them, in refusing to let their story fade into just another headline. Even now, the story of the Ford family haunts Cornwall. People still drive past the places where their bodies were found, still speak in hushed tones about that summer when the illusion of safety shattered, and parents, perhaps without even realizing it, hug their children tighter, watching more closely for the hidden dangers that might lurk behind the facade of normalcy. The Ford family murders are not just the story of one man's evil. They are the story of resilience broken, of innocence lost, and of the terrifying truth that sometimes the greatest dangers are not strangers at all, but the people we share our homes with. The story of Robert William Fisher is one of the darkest in American crime history, not just because of what he did, but because of what followed. Even now, years later, his name lingers on lists of fugitives, his face appearing on wanted posters, as if the shadow of his crime refuses to fade. What he left behind wasn't only a crime scene. It was a crater in the lives of everyone who knew his family, a chilling reminder that sometimes the monster lives inside the house, wears the face of a husband and father, and waits for the moment to destroy everything. Robert Fisher lived in Scottsdale, Arizona, with his wife, Mary, and their 2 children, 12-year-old Brittany and 10-year-old Bobby. To the outside world, they looked like a normal family. Neighbors saw them coming and going, attending church, doing the things families do. But inside their home, Robert was a man no one truly understood. He was controlling, strict, and often cruel. His marriage was crumbling, weighed down by his temper, his paranoia, and the suffocating way he demanded obedience. Mary had confided in friends that she was thinking about divorce. For her, leaving was the only way to escape his iron grip. For Robert, that thought was unbearable. On April 10th, 2001, the Fisher family story reached its horrific end. Investigators believe the day began like many others, with the quiet tension of a household held together by fragile threads. But Robert wasn't going to let those threads break naturally. That night, in the early hours of the morning, he acted on a plan so cold that even seasoned detectives still struggle to describe it without emotion. He killed Mary first. She was 38 years old, a woman who had tried to build a life for her children even while trapped in a marriage that weighed her down. Robert slit her throat, ending her life with calculated brutality. Then he turned on his children. Brittany, only 12, and Bobby, just 10, were smothered in their beds. 2 young lives silenced before they even had a chance to fight back. What makes the crime even more haunting is the intimacy of it. This wasn't a stranger's violence. This was a father murdering his own children while they slept, their innocence no protection against his rage. But Robert didn't stop with their murders. He needed to erase the scene, to cover his tracks in a way that would make discovery slower, more confusing. He rigged the house to explode, turning the family home into a bomb. Hours later, as flames engulfed the building, neighbors woke to the thunderous sound of the blast, windows rattling, smoke billowing into the Arizona sky. Firefighters rushed to the scene, battling the inferno, only to uncover what no one wanted to find. The bodies of Mary, Brittany, and Bobby destroyed by fire, but revealing the truth of what had happened before the flames. Forensic examinations showed the house fire was no accident. Gas lines had been deliberately manipulated, accelerants used, The explosion carefully staged to look like a tragedy, but screaming of sabotage. And the most chilling detail of all, Robert Fisher was gone. At first, neighbors thought he might have been a victim too, trapped in the fire with his family. But the evidence said otherwise. His truck was later discovered abandoned in a remote forest area near Young, Arizona, miles from his home. Inside were traces of his life, his dog left behind, his belongings scattered, but Robert himself had vanished. The manhunt for Fisher began immediately. He wasn't just a suspect, he was the suspect. The FBI added him to its 10 most wanted list, his face plastered across America, his description read aloud in news reports night after night. People claimed to see him everywhere, from Arizona to Canada, even in parts of Latin America. Each sighting sparked a flurry of investigation, but each one fizzled out, leaving nothing but frustration. What made the case so difficult was Robert's background. He was a hunter, an outdoorsman, a man who knew how to survive in rough conditions. Some believed he had disappeared into the wilderness, living off the land, hiding in caves or cabins, watching the world search for him from a distance. Others thought he had fled the country, using money or connections to vanish into a new life under a false identity. And then there were those who believed he was dead, his body hidden somewhere the search would never find. For Mary's family, for the families of Brittany and Bobby, the not knowing was its own torment. It wasn't just grief they carried. It was the endless waiting, the questions that never found answers. Every year that passed was another year without justice. Another year with Robert Fisher's name still echoing like a curse. In Scottsdale, the house that once stood as the Fisher family home was nothing but ashes. But the scar remained, a reminder for neighbors of the night everything changed. People who had waved to the Fishers in passing now looked at one another differently, questioning how well they really knew anyone. The investigation stretched on for decades. The FBI followed leads across states, checked fingerprints against countless records, even tried to trace possible financial transactions. But Robert Fisher was like smoke, always present in theory, never solid in reality. In 2021, after 20 years of searching, the FBI quietly removed him from the 10 most wanted list. Not because they believed he was innocent, but because the trail had gone cold and resources were needed elsewhere. Still, his case remains open. His status remains fugitive. And somewhere out there, the possibility lingers that Robert Fisher is still alive, living under another name, his past buried like a corpse in the desert. What makes his crime so unforgettable isn't only the brutality, but the betrayal. A father is supposed to protect his children, to guard them from harm. A husband is supposed to stand beside his wife. Robert Fisher did the opposite. He turned his family into enemies simply because they threatened his control. And when faced with the possibility of losing them through divorce, he chose to annihilate them instead. I can't help but picture Brittany and Bobby in their final moments. Maybe they never woke, maybe they never knew. But I think about the years they never had. The school dances, the birthdays, the milestones that vanished in a single night. I think about Mary, who found the courage to consider leaving a toxic marriage, only to pay with her life before she ever had the chance to start over. And I think about Robert, not as a mystery fugitive, but as a man who destroyed everything in his own home and walked away into the night without looking back. The Fisher murders are more than a story of crime. They're a wound carved into Arizona's history, a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with strangers in alleys. Sometimes it hides in family portraits, in backyard barbecues, in the walls of suburban houses that look just like everyone else's. Robert Fisher is still out there, or maybe he isn't. Maybe the desert swallowed him years ago. But until the truth is known, His name will hover in the air like smoke from the fire, he said. A reminder of the night he murdered his family and disappeared into nothingness. The disappearance of Heather Elvis is a story that refuses to fade because it was never given an ending. There is no grave to visit, no final goodbye, only the lingering absence of a 20-year-old woman whose life was cut short by jealousy, obsession, and betrayal. What makes her story so haunting is that even though people were convicted for what happened, Heather herself was never found, leaving her family in a permanent state of grief that feels like a wound that never heals. Heather lived in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, a young woman with bright eyes and a laugh that could pull people in. She was finding her way in the world, working as a hostess at a restaurant, trying to figure out what she wanted her future to look like. Like many women her age, she wanted love, adventure, and a little escape from the ordinary. That desire led her down a path that would ultimately become deadly. She met Sidney Moore, a local handyman who was older, married, and a father. At first, their relationship was casual, a secret affair filled with thrill and danger. Sidney gave Heather attention and promises, and she believed him when he said things between him and his wife, Tammy, were broken. For Heather, the relationship felt like a chance at something real, a future that might be messy but exciting. For Sidney, it was an escape from the control of his wife. But affairs never stay secret forever, and soon Tammy found out. Tammy Moore was not the kind of woman to forgive or forget. She was enraged, humiliated, and determined to destroy the girl she saw as the cause of her humiliation. From a moment she discovered the affair, Heather's life turned into a living hell. Tammy began harassing her, sending cruel texts, stalking her, and reminding her at every turn that she was being watched. Heather, still young and vulnerable, tried to break away, but Sidney wouldn't fully let go, and Tammy wouldn't stop the torment. On the night of December 17th, 2013, Heather went on a date with another man, trying to move forward with her life. She came home smiling, hopeful, maybe even feeling like she was starting to escape the grip of Sidney and Tammy. But in the early hours of December 18th, everything changed. Sidney called her. Investigators believe that call was the bait, the lure to bring Heather out one last time. Whether it was promises of love, pleas for another chance, or some manipulation only Sidney could craft, Heather listened. Around 2 a.m., she drove to meet him. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. Her car was later discovered at Peachtree Landing, a quiet, isolated area near the Waccamaw River. The keys were still inside. Her purse, her belongings, all untouched. It looked like she had parked her car and simply vanished into the night. But people don't vanish. Someone makes them disappear. The investigation into Heather's disappearance quickly zeroed in on Sidney and Tammy Moore. Phone records showed the call that lured Heather out. Surveillance footage placed Sidney near the area. Witnesses came forward with pieces of information that, when stitched together, pointed toward the couple. The Moores, once seen as just another husband and wife in Myrtle Beach, became the center of a nightmare no one could ignore. When police questioned them, Tammy's hatred for Heather was impossible to hide. She spoke of her with venom, her jealousy like acid eating through every word. Sidney, on the other hand, tried to play it off, to act like Heather was just a fling that didn't matter, but the evidence painted a different picture. He had wanted her, and Tammy had wanted revenge. Together, they had turned their twisted emotions into a plan. The prosecution later argued that Sidney lured Heather out to Peachtree Landing that night, where Tammy was waiting. Whether Heather was taken by force, attacked immediately, or held captive for a short time, no one knows. What is clear is that she never came back. The couple disposed of her body in a way so thorough that it has never been found. For Heather's parents, the days after her disappearance were a blur of searching, praying, and clinging to any shred of hope. Volunteers combed the woods, dragged rivers, and searched miles of countryside. Flyers with Heather's smiling face were posted everywhere. Her family appeared on television, begging for answers, begging for her safe return. But each day that passed made it harder to believe she would be found alive. The case dragged on for years, weighed down by legal battles, retrials, and the stubborn silence of the Moors. Finally, in 2018, both Sydney and Tammy were convicted of kidnapping Heather Elvis. They were each sentenced to 30 years in prison, a punishment for what they had done, even though murder charges could never be proven without a body. It was justice, but it wasn't closure. To this day, Heather's body has never been recovered. Her parents live with the unbearable reality of not knowing where their daughter's final resting place is. They can't place flowers on her grave, can't whisper to her beneath a headstone. They can only keep her memory alive through pictures, stories, and the aching hole left by her absence. When I think about Heather, I don't just think of the crime. I think of the girl who was full of life and possibility, a young woman caught in a storm she didn't fully understand. She wasn't perfect, none of us are, but she didn't deserve the hate that was thrown at her, the cruelty that ended her life. She was 20 years old, still learning who she was, still chasing the kind of love that everyone deserves to find. The disappearance of Heather Elvis reminds us that jealousy can be as deadly as any weapon. Tammy's rage turned into obsession, and Sydney's weakness turned into betrayal. Together, they ended a life and left a family with nothing but questions. And until Heather is found, until her family has answers, the story will remain open, bleeding into every year that passes. Sometimes I wonder what Heather's last moments were like. Did she realize the trap she had walked into? Did she plead for her life? Or was it taken from her before she had a chance to speak? Those are questions we may never have answered, locked away forever with the people who refuse to tell the truth. But what is certain is this: Heather Elvis mattered. She was not just a victim in a headline. She was a daughter, a friend, a young woman with dreams. And though her body remains missing, her story continues to echo in Myrtle Beach and beyond, a warning of what jealousy, lies, and betrayal can do when left to fester. There are some people who seem too good to ever disappear, people who feel like the heart of town, the kind who hold things together just by being there. For a small Vermont community, that person was Evangeline Blackwood. She wasn't just a teacher. She was a mentor, a confidant, the sort of woman who believed every student had potential, even the ones everyone else gave up on. That's why, when she failed to show up to work one Monday morning, the absence was like a lightning strike, sudden, loud, and terrifying. Her car was found parked at the local marina. The keys were inside, her purse on the passenger seat. The vehicle was locked, which suggested she had gotten out willingly, maybe even trusting whoever she had met. It didn't look like a robbery, didn't look like she'd just gone for a walk. The scene felt staged, and from the very beginning, everyone knew something terrible had happened. Detective Rosalind Hayes was assigned to the case, and she felt the weight of it instantly. A missing teacher in a small town is not like a missing stranger in a city. Everyone knew Evangeline. Parents knew her from conferences, students from her classroom, colleagues from late nights, grading papers in the teacher's lounge. The fear spread fast, and it wasn't just the fear of losing her. It was the fear of what it meant if someone could make her vanish. As Rosalind dug in, she discovered something few people knew. Evangeline had been receiving threatening letters. Not the kind you can brush off as crank mail, but messages that were specific, direct, and dangerous. The letters accused her of meddling in things that weren't her business, of digging where she didn't belong. They warned her to stop, but she hadn't. And that stubborn bravery, the very thing that made her such a remarkable teacher, might have been what cost her everything. The deeper Rosalind looked, the uglier the truth became. Evangeline had uncovered a scandal within the school. Grades were being altered, not by students sneaking into the system, but by adults at the top. Parents with influence, money, or both were paying the principal to change grades, to turn failing marks into glowing transcripts, to guarantee college acceptances that were never earned. It was a web of corruption woven tightly into the very fabric of the school system. Evangeline had discovered it by accident, noticing inconsistencies in grade reports, realizing that some students who barely showed up to class were suddenly excelling on paper. When she pushed for answers, the pushback was immediate and hostile. But she didn't stop. She had started gathering evidence. Copies of grade sheets, secret notes of conversations, names of parents who had paid for fraud. She had built a case quietly, carefully, waiting for the right moment to bring it forward. That moment was supposed to come the weekend before she disappeared. She had arranged to meet someone, no one knew who, to hand over the evidence. But after that night, she never came home. Rosalind pieced together the fragments, but it felt like running against a current that kept dragging her back. Every time she got close to uncovering something solid, someone else seemed to shut it down. Records vanished, witnesses grew silent, and the fear in town deepened. Parents who had once praised Evangeline now avoided talking about her, afraid their own names might come up in connection with the fraud. The principal refused to cooperate, hiding behind lawyers and technicalities. And the teachers who might have supported her looked at the ground instead, unwilling to put their jobs on the line. The marina, though, remained the key. Surveillance footage showed a shadowy figure meeting Evangeline that night. The images weren't clear, grainy camera work that made identification impossible, but what mattered was the timeline. She got out of her car, walked toward the figure, and then nothing. She never returned. Whoever she met led her away, and from there, her trail went dark. The community clung to hope at first. Maybe she had gone into hiding, maybe she was safe somewhere, waiting for the right time to come back with the truth. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the hope turned brittle. Rosalind knew better. People don't leave their cars, their purses, their lives behind unless something forces them to. As the investigation spread, whispers grew louder. Some said the parents involved in the fraud had panicked, that exposing them would have ruined reputations, destroyed college prospects, and maybe even landed them in jail. Others thought the principal had orchestrated the whole thing, desperate to keep his position safe. And there were darker rumors still, ones that suggested Evangeline had stumbled into something even bigger than academic fraud, that the money exchanging hands was tied to more than just grade changes. But without her evidence, everything was speculation. Rosalind refused to give up, chasing down every lead, no matter how thin. She followed the trail into financial records, piecing together payments that seemed far too large for donations and far too frequent to be coincidence. She interviewed students who admitted they knew their parents had helped with their grades, though none dared to say how. Each clue added to the weight pressing on her, the undeniable truth that Evangeline had been right and that her disappearance wasn't random. The hardest part was facing Evangeline's family. Her parents aged years and weeks, their eyes hollow with grief, but still burning with the need for answers. Her students left flowers at the school, notes tucked into the cracks of her locked classroom door, messages that read, "We miss you," and "Please come back." And the town itself, once united in admiration for her, became divided between those who wanted the truth no matter the cost, and those who wanted to bury the scandal with her. No body was ever found. No confession was ever given. Sydney and Tammy Moore in Myrtle Beach were convicted without a body. But here in Vermont, the silence was heavier, the gaps wider. Rosalind fought to keep the case alive, refusing to let Evangeline's name fade from the headlines. But as time passed, fewer people spoke about her. The scandal was swept under the rug. The school quietly restructured, the principal eventually resigning for personal reasons. Parents moved on, students graduated, and the story became just another unsolved mystery in a town that wanted to forget. But forgetting is impossible for those who loved her. For Rosalind, for Evangeline's family, and for the students who still remember the way she lit up a classroom, the wound stays open. Every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, vigils are held at the marina. Candles flicker in the cold Vermont night, their glow reflected in the dark water, as if waiting for her to come walking back to her car. What makes this story so disturbing isn't only the disappearance, but the silence that followed. A woman who stood up for what was right, who tried to protect the integrity of her school and the futures of her students, was punished for her bravery. She didn't vanish into the night on her own. She was taken, silenced, erased. And somewhere out there, the people responsible continue with their lives, their secrets buried deeper with every passing year. I can still see her car in my mind, sitting there at the marina like a question that can't be answered. The purse, the keys, the empty driver's seat, all of it pointing to the moment she stepped out and trusted the wrong person. That trust was her final mistake, and it cost her everything. The case of Evangeline Blackwood remains open, a cold file filled with missing pieces. But in the hearts of those who knew her, she's not just a name on a report. She's the teacher who stayed after class to help struggling students. She's the woman who dared to stand against corruption. She's the daughter who promised her parents she'd be home for dinner. And she's the ghost that lingers in a town that would rather forget but never truly can. There's something about people who chase the truth that makes their disappearances feel different. It's not like they drift away quietly. It's as if the very act of uncovering lies puts a target on their back. That's what happened with Serafina Beaumont, a forensic accountant whose mind was as sharp as a blade and whose stubbornness may have cost her everything. She wasn't a celebrity, not someone whose face you'd recognize on the street. But in her world, she was dangerous because she could follow numbers the way others follow footprints, and numbers never lie. Serafina was the kind of woman who lived neatly. Her apartment in the city was organized, her files labeled, her schedule precise. She wasn't flashy, but she was meticulous, and that made her good at her job. Forensic accounting isn't glamorous, but it's powerful. Tracing money, exposing fraud, cutting through the stories criminals tell with the cold certainty of bank statements and wire transfers. That's what she was doing when she vanished. Following the trail of money through a local charity that everyone thought was untouchable. The charity was well known, the kind that hosted banquets with champagne and speeches, the kind that collected donations with glossy brochures and tearful videos of children in need. People wrote checks proudly, believing their money was helping the less fortunate. But Serafina had started to notice things, discrepancies in reports, transfers that didn't make sense, accounts that led to places they shouldn't. She pulled the threads and found something horrifying. The charity wasn't just failing to use donations properly, it was funneling massive sums into the personal accounts of its own board members. Prominent community leaders, people who gave speeches about generosity, were pocketing the very money meant to save lives. Serafina knew what she had found was explosive. She made copies of everything: spreadsheets, transaction logs, correspondence that hinted at the corruption. She had planned to take it all to the FBI the following week. She even confided in a colleague that she believed she was sitting on one of the biggest fraud cases in years. But before she could hand it over, she stopped answering calls. At first, no one thought much of it. Maybe she was working late. Maybe she'd gone away for the weekend. But when days turned into silence, concern grew. Her friends tried reaching her. Her parents, who lived in another state, hadn't heard from her either. Finally, someone went to her apartment. What they found was unsettling. The door was locked. Inside, everything was in place. Her bed made, dishes clean, not a sign of struggle. But her laptop, her files, the very documents she'd been working on were gone. It was as if someone had come in, taken only the pieces that mattered, and left without disturbing anything else. Detective Lysander Cross was assigned to the case, and from the start, he felt the unease that always comes with a disappearance tied to corruption. Missing people are difficult enough, but missing people who were about to expose powerful names, that's a storm waiting to happen. He began by tracing her last movements, interviewing neighbors, checking security footage. Nothing concrete appeared, but the shadow of the charity loomed over every lead. The board members denied everything, of course. They painted Serafina as a troubled woman, someone who might have cracked under pressure, maybe even run away. But Cross didn't buy it. She had been steady, disciplined. She wasn't the type to leave her apartment spotless, but walk out without her purse, her phone, or her documents. No, this wasn't voluntary. This was a cleanup job. The more he dug, the more dangerous it became. He found patterns in the finances that supported Serafina's claims. Large sums moving from donation accounts to shell companies, then into personal investments. It was clever, layers deep, but the fingerprints of fraud were there. And every time he followed a new lead, he felt eyes on him. Phones clicking when no one was on the line. Cars trailing him at night. It was clear that Serafina had been right. She had uncovered something massive, and the people behind it weren't just greedy, they were ruthless. Meanwhile, her family suffered the agony of uncertainty. Her mother gave interviews, pleading for her daughter's safe return, holding up pictures of her smiling face. Her father grew quiet, hollowed out by the not knowing. Friends set up vigils, candles lined along the sidewalk outside her building. They prayed she would walk back through the door, even as the evidence suggested she never would. The charity tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. Galas were still held, donations still collected, the board members still smiling in their suits and dresses. But whispers spread. People who once wrote checks began to wonder where their money was going. Reporters circled, trying to link Serafina's disappearance to the financial irregularities she had been investigating. Some stories made it to the papers, but without Serafina's files, without her testimony, it was all smoke with no fire. Cross kept pushing. He believed Serafina had left behind something, a clue hidden in her methodical way. And he was right. In her apartment, behind a row of neatly stacked books, he found a flash drive taped to the back of the shelf. On it were pieces of the puzzle she had been assembling. Transaction records, names, dates. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to prove she had been onto something real. Enough to suggest she had been silenced for it. But the drive didn't reveal where she was or what had been done to her. And without a body, without direct evidence of foul play, the case stalled. The charity's board members remained free, whispers swirling, but nothing sticking. Cross knew in his gut that they were responsible, but knowing and proving are different things. And so the case grew cold, like too many others. To this day, no one knows where Serafina is. Maybe she lies buried in some unmarked place, her voice forever silenced. Maybe she was taken far away, her identity erased by the very people she threatened to expose. Or maybe, though it seems impossible, she is still out there, hiding, waiting for the moment to finish what she started. But each year that passes makes that hope dimmer. What makes her story so disturbing is not just the disappearance itself, but what it says about the world we live in. A young woman who tried to do the right thing, who dared to expose corruption, was erased because she threatened the wrong people. And those people, the ones who profited off charity, continue on, their reputations bruised, but their lives intact, while her family lives in torment. I think often about what it must have been like for her in those last moments. Did she see it coming? Did she open her door to someone she trusted, only to realize too late what they were there to do? Did she fight, scream, beg? Or was it swift, her voice stolen before she could even cry out? The not knowing is its own kind of cruelty, and it's a cruelty her parents carry every day. The lost accountant, that's what people call her now. But Serafina was more than that. She was a daughter, a friend, a woman who wanted to use her skills to make the world better. She believed in truth, and she believed in accountability. And for that belief, she vanished. Her story stands as a warning, but also as a symbol. A warning of how fragile safety can be when it collides with power, and a symbol of the bravery it takes to stand up to corruption even when the cost is everything. Serafina Beaumont followed the money, and the money led to her disappearance. But her name, her courage, and her unfinished work still echo in the silence she left behind. There are some disappearances that feel like they slipped through your fingers no matter how tightly you try to hold onto the details. And the case of Bastien Moreau is one of those. He wasn't famous, he wasn't powerful, he wasn't even particularly well known outside of his neighborhood. He was just a man who ran a small electronics repair shop, the kind of place people depended on when their phones cracked, their laptops froze, or their televisions sputtered into static. He had calloused hands, tired eyes, and a quiet determination to keep his business afloat. And then, one day, he simply vanished, leaving behind a ransacked shop and a trail of questions that still haven't been answered. Bastien was the sort of person people described as reliable. He opened his shop early, stayed late, and rarely closed except for the occasional Sunday. Customers liked him because he was honest. If something could be fixed cheaply, he would tell them. If it wasn't worth repairing, he wouldn't waste their time. He lived alone, spent most of his time working, and didn't stir up trouble. That's why when his store was suddenly found closed in the middle of a busy week, the lights off, the windows dark, people noticed immediately. It wasn't like him. A neighbor was the first to grow concerned. She had stopped by with a broken tablet, only to find the front door locked and the open sign still hanging in the window. Peering inside, she saw overturned chairs, tools scattered across the counter, and a sense of disorder that didn't match Bastien's tidy habits. She called the police, who arrived to find the shop indeed ransacked. Drawers were open, boxes knocked over, wires strewn like someone had been searching for something specific. But oddly enough, nothing obvious was missing. The cash register still held money. Expensive equipment sat untouched. It wasn't a robbery in the traditional sense. The most chilling part, however, was that Bastien himself was nowhere to be found. His car remained parked behind the shop, his keys on the hook where he always left them, his phone sitting on the counter as if abandoned mid-use. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no fingerprints that didn't belong. It was as if he had been plucked from the air, leaving only the chaos behind. Detective Cordelia Kane was brought in to lead the investigation, and immediately she knew this wasn't going to be a simple missing person case. The shop wasn't just a shop. As she dug deeper, she learned that Bastien had uncovered something he wasn't supposed to. Hidden among his repair logs and receipts were notes he had scribbled, lists of serial numbers, unusual patterns of devices coming in and out, and financial records he had no reason to be keeping. It didn't take long to realize what he had stumbled upon. His shop was being used as a front for money laundering. It worked like this: electronics were dropped off, supposedly for repairs. In reality, large sums of money were funneled through fake invoices, disguised as payments for parts and labor. On paper, it all looked legitimate, but in reality, the shop was being used to wash dirty money clean. And somehow, Bastian had discovered it. Cordelia found evidence that Bastian had started keeping detailed records of the transactions, quietly logging everything he thought was suspicious. He wasn't a criminal himself, but he wasn't stupid either. He knew that what was happening under his nose was illegal. The question was whether he had been complicit at first, or if he had simply been dragged into it without realizing until it was too late. What mattered more was what he planned to do with the information. Notes in his handwriting suggested he had been preparing to contact authorities. He had written names, dates, even a draft letter he never got the chance to send. That decision to expose what he found may have sealed his fate. The ransacked shop suddenly made sense. Whoever was using his store as a front must have discovered that he was keeping records. They had come in, searched for his files, and taken them. But in doing so, they had also taken him. Whether he had been forced out at gunpoint, lured under false pretenses, or worse, no one knew. What was clear was that the men behind the laundering couldn't risk letting him speak. The investigation widened quickly. Cordelia discovered a network of businesses across the city that all seemed to be tied to the same laundering scheme. Restaurants, car washes, pawn shops, all moving money through the same system. The electronic shop had just been one cog in a much larger machine. And if Bastian had uncovered enough, he could have brought the entire operation down. That gave them every reason to silence him. The community was shaken. Bastian wasn't a man who made enemies. He was quiet, polite, dependable. To think of him being caught up in organized crime was almost unthinkable. Yet the evidence pointed clearly to the fact that he had stumbled too close to something dangerous. His neighbors left flowers outside the locked shop door, small tributes to a man they feared would never come back. Cordelia chased every lead she could. Witnesses reported seeing unfamiliar men near the shop in the days before Bastian disappeared. Men who didn't fit in, who watched more than they shopped. Surveillance footage from a gas station nearby showed a dark vehicle idling close to the shop the night he vanished. But the plates were unreadable, the faces blurred. It was enough to confirm suspicion, but not enough to make an arrest. The case dragged on. Rumors swirled through the town. Some said Bastian had been killed and buried somewhere remote. Others believed he had been forced to flee, hidden away, or even killed abroad as part of the laundering network's cleanup. A few whispered that maybe he had joined them, taken the money, and disappeared on his own. But those who knew him best refused to believe it. He wasn't a man who ran. He was a man who fixed things, who stayed until the job was done. His family suffered the slow torture of not knowing. His sister gave tearful interviews describing how he had always been the one who held their family together, the one they could rely on. His parents clung to the hope that maybe he was alive somewhere, held against his will, but still breathing. But as months turned into years, hope grew thinner, stretched until it was almost invisible. Cordelia never gave up, though. The case became personal to her. Every time she walked past another small shop in town, she thought of Bastian, thought of how fragile the line is between ordinary life and something sinister lurking beneath. She believed his notes still existed somewhere, tucked away in the hands of the people who silenced him. But without them, without his body, the case remained unsolved. The truth is that Bastian Moreau disappeared because he saw too much. He was an ordinary man who happened to pull on the wrong thread, and when the fabric began to unravel, those protecting it made sure he was gone. The tragedy is not only that he vanished, but that his disappearance left no answers, only an empty shop with its lights out and a family left to wonder. Even now, people still talk about him in hushed tones. His shop sits abandoned, a for lease sign hanging crooked in the window, the memory of what happened seeping out like a shadow across the street. Some avoid it, crossing to the other side of the road rather than look in. Others pause, staring through the glass as if expecting him to come out from the back, wiping his hands on a rag, ready to greet them. But he never does. The story of Bastien Moreau isn't just about one man. It's about how crime can seep into the quietest corners, how money can corrupt even the simplest of places, and how one person's courage to expose it can cost them everything. He was a shop owner, a fixer of broken things. But in the end, he couldn't fix the danger that had crept into his life, and it consumed him. All that remains now is the unanswered question: where is Bastien Moreau? Until that question is answered, his story will remain unfinished, a scar on a town that still remembers the man who disappeared without a trace.